Hey guys, so today we're doing the second part of the rhetorical appeals, academic persuasion and logic, focusing mostly on logic and when our attempt to use logic goes wrong, so logical fallacies. This presentation usually goes a lot better face to face because there's a lot of practice in it. So I'm just going to kind of have to walk you through it without the practice component. So you'll just kind of have to bear with me on that. So just a quick overview. When I say logical fallacies, I kind of just mean like logical untruths or faulty logic. Sometimes I'll say bad logic or unfair logic. We said that the use of logic is making what you're saying, your reason with the evidence and how you're explaining it, making that make sense to your reader. So basically a logical fallacy is something that when you hear it, it might make sense at first, but if you really pick it apart, something seems off in terms of how it makes sense or how it comes together. It's often if your reader picks up on the fact that you're doing this or that you've made an error, then it's, inaccurate or misleading information, and it does actually weaken your argument. And a lot of times popular arguments will attempt to use logical fallacies often to try to kind of manipulate people. And unfairly use things like emotion and bad appeals to credibility and things like that, assuming or hoping that the reader won't pick up on it, because logical fallacies can be very convincing if your reader doesn't pick up on it. But if they do, then it can kind of shoot you in the foot. So sometimes it's unintentional. We use bad logic all the time. I know no one wants to think about themselves as using bad logic, but we do it all the time in like casual conversations, like kind of everyday communication without even realizing it accidentally. So it's not always intentional. And we do it in writing a lot unintentionally. Sometimes it's malicious, because the person arguing is relying on the audience ignorance of the issue. So not assuming that you don't know much about it to be able to pick up what they're doing, or relying on audience trust. A lot of times when we watch different news stations, I know we kind of know that there's, some bias in the news, but I think especially when we're watching like the one that we trust, like there's some implicit trust there. Like this is, and we do it, online when we read articles, there's this implicit sort of like, they have been researching this issue, or they are the one that was there on the scene, or they are a professional, and of course they know more about this than I do. So some relying on that implicit trust, or believing that you're not going to look into the issue. And a lot of times, we're bombarded with information all day long and people's opinions and arguments about things. So, in reality, we don't have time necessarily to look further into every argument that we come across, and sometimes people will use that to their advantage. So it's important to recognize, so the goal of this presentation is not that you memorize every single logical fallacy out there, but that you do get in the habit of noticing when someone's, I guess, feeding you a line, or when something sounds a little bit off. Not just to avoid it in your communication, but to notice when it's coming at you as a critical reader. So there's a couple of types or ways that logical fallacies happen. They are used to distract, distort, or omit information. So either, distract you from the real point, and get you focused on something else. To distort, like, that's usually like in the wording, or in how they're portraying an issue maybe unfairly. Omitting information, so that's when we're like omitting evidence that makes us look wrong, things like that. It often happens by over-relying on another appeal besides logic. So in an attempt to convince your reader to think that what you're saying makes sense, we lean too much into emotional or authoritative appeals, or even disguise those appeals as logic. Like using a celebrity. Like if you, used a celebrity to endorse your product and they had no expertise, you're relying on that name or the fact that people like or admire that person and not their actual expertise. And that's an unfair, like leaning into an authoritative appeal because the person's not actually an authority. So when it's emotion, it's relying unfairly on the audience's emotion. So we talked about how pathos is really easy to kind of manipulate. When you're relying unfairly on guilt or insecurity, fear, and you kind of target and focus more on that. authority or trust. So again, focusing on authority where none exists, like our cultural use of celebrities, or focusing on solely on character assassination. So focusing on picking apart this person's character as opposed to their actual argument. And logic, again, that's distorting, that's distracting, omitting like the evidence that's being presented. I want to make this clarification really quick. Disagreeing is not the same thing as bad logic. You can disagree with someone and both of you can have solid logic. It's often not about the issue itself when we're talking about logic or a whole group of people. We're talking about an individual presentation of ideas. A logical fallacy is how this person is presenting their ideas in this moment. It's situational. So a couple of things to think about in terms of how this works is that two people can have differing views and both make valid points. That's why it's important to really be a critical reader and think about and thinker and see potential gray area in the situation in a conversation. The conversation exists because all the people involved think they have valid points. And often they do have valid points and valid concerns. It's possible for, differing views to both have solid points and exist within the same conversation. It's not just black and white, yes or no, right or wrong. And the goal of persuasion is to convince your audience that your ideas are valid and worth considering, that what you're saying makes sense. Not necessarily that you are 100% right and they should completely disregard every concern that they have and agree with you. False. So again, like kind of coming back to the idea that faulty logic is rarely about the issue itself. It's about how that writer or speaker at that time is going about trying to convince others in that situation. It's a failure to present your ideas fairly and accurately based on evidence. So I want you to write down these couple of things. This is going to kind of a couple of tips to avoid logical fallacies and arguments, especially in your digital essay. One, make sure you're using valid reasons that are not overly emotional, that you can find evidence for, that you can explain, give examples of, and you can flesh out. Make sure your reasons have factual evidence. Make sure you're not making statements that are just based on your opinion without evidence. That's how you avoid the whole bias thing. And have a fair academic argument. And a lot of times we throw in our opinions and we don't even realize we're not connecting it to evidence. So sometimes it can sound easy enough, but it actually takes some practice and really kind of paying attention to where you're making claims and saying things that are debatable and don't have evidence, where you're drawing conclusions about a situation but don't have it based it on any sort of data. Verifying that the most important or relevant aspects of the issue are being addressed. So making sure you're not just being distracting in any way or kind of overdoing it in certain areas, or that you're pulling in information that's not relevant. Again, like bombarding people with unnecessary like background information or other types of information and stories and things that are going to detract from the argument. So you just want to make sure that what you're providing is really what's important to the issue at hand. Avoiding making claims and saying things that are emotional, zealous, sweeping, and can't be supported, and avoiding those absolute descriptors like all, always, everyone, never, that kind of stuff. Checking for fair acknowledgement and representation of multiple opinions or courses of action, making sure that you have other opinions in there, that you're not straw manning them, that you're describing them fairly in ways that aren't going to piss them off.